In this episode, let's get you some samples of a variety of different voiceover microphones. To get started, let's go ahead and give you a sample of these different microphones we're going to listen to here today on both my voice and on Danny's voice. We're going to take a look at a variety of them. We have the Lewitt LCT 440 Pure, we have the TechZone Audio Stellar X2 and the X2 Vintage, we have the Rode NT1, the NT1A, and the Sennheiser MKH416, and finally, the AKG C414. In full disclosure, I purchased all of the microphones except for the Lewitt. The Lewitt was given to me free by Lewitt themselves, and I'm going to do a review on this in the next few weeks here. As you listen to these samples, please use the best headphones possible.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. So hopefully you can make your own judgments on which of those sounded best on my voice and on Danny's voice. It's a subjective thing. It's not perfectly objective. So you might have a different impression than I do. You might have a different impression than someone else who leaves a comment on this video. That's perfectly fine. I'm hoping this could be a good exercise for you to develop your hearing. And nobody's born with golden ears as far as I'm concerned. I think you really have to develop that skill, listen to lots of different things critically, and start to identify things that you like and don't like necessarily about a particular voice into a particular microphone. And it really depends on a lot of things. Also, there is no such thing as a perfect microphone. There is not a perfect microphone that is perfect for every voice. So again, there's some subjectivity here, and what sounds good to you may not sound good to somebody else. So let me give you my impressions, and then we'll talk about voiceover microphones in more general terms. Now, just to give you my background, I am not a full-time voiceover artist. I have done some professional voiceover work, and I've used a variety of different microphones. Obviously, this does not even come close to representing all voiceover microphones by a long shot. And so keep that in mind here. For example, we don't have any Neumann microphones here, which are very popular amongst professional voiceover artists. The U87, of course, the TLM 103 is a very popular one as well. We didn't have those here, so you just get to hear what I have. So really just use this as a data point. It's an opportunity for you here to my voice and my wife's voice sampled through these microphones. You'll probably want to listen to samples from other people's voices as well if you're looking in particular at one of these mics. So let's take a closer look here. So first of all, let's talk about the Rode NT1. That was the first microphone. To me, this microphone actually has a pretty good overall sound. It works pretty well on most voices in my experience so far. It does have a crisp high end, but it's not overly crisp and grating. And it also does have that low end, rich kind of lush sound to it. And it does okay in the mid-range as well. So I think overall it's really a pretty good buy, and it will work well on a lot of voices. If you don't have time to do any more research and you need to make a decision quickly and you're buying somewhere in the $300 price range, I think the Rode NT1 is a really great choice. Next up, we have the Rode NT1A. This was actually the very first large diaphragm condenser microphone I purchased, and it is very similar to the NT1. It was actually made earlier, and this one was actually released later in 2014. It does sound a little bit crisper, so the high frequencies are emphasized a little bit more. And if you are someone with a very dark voice that doesn't have a lot of articulation or sibilance, and sibilance is the sound, the sizzling sound that you get when you say the letter S or C. If you don't have a lot of that in your voice, this can be really nice at kind of adding that little additional sparkle and articulation to your voice. So it's a good microphone for that. For my voice, it's a little bit much because I do have a fair bit of sibilance going. For my wife's voice, it actually sounds pretty good, although I think I probably prefer both of our voices a little bit more on the newer NT1. Next up is the Sennheiser MKH416, the only shotgun microphone that we included in this particular comparison because this one is quite popular amongst voiceover artists. And in fact, there are plenty of professional voiceover artists using this particular microphone. Now, this one is an interesting microphone. It was originally designed, the original version of it was designed in the 1970s, as I recall. And that was back in the analog recording days when we recorded to tape. And tape had an interesting characteristic where it wasn't particularly sensitive in the higher frequencies. And so the voicing, or the way they kind of sculpted the sound of the MKH416, added a little bit more high frequency response to it so that it would get a nice balanced sound on a tape recording. And nevertheless, it's still a very popular microphone today, even though 99.9% of our recordings these days are all digital. And digital tends to be much more sensitive in the higher frequencies relative to tape recording. So this one still has a very interesting sound. Very nice, rich low end. The mid-range seems to be sculpted out just a little bit. And then also a very crisp high end. A lot of people like that sound. I think, again, if you don't have a ton of sibilance in your voice, this can sound very good. I think it sounded very nice on my wife's voice. Some people just really like that crisp sound, and it's still, for that reason, a very popular microphone. Next up is the AKG C414. Now, this was an interesting microphone. And in fact, I purchased this specifically for my voice for voiceover work. As it turns out, I don't think it's the greatest choice. Now, this is the C414 XLS. There are a variety of different versions of this microphone. The XLS is supposed to be a much more neutral sounding microphone. That is to say, it doesn't have a really strong presence boost in the higher frequencies. And I think what happened is, in terms of my impressions, is on my wife's voice, this really doesn't sound that good. It made her voice sound very dull and not very, very nice. It does something funny in the mid-range as well. On my voice, I think it sounded a little bit better, but still not my favorite. Passable, definitely, for voiceover work. I think that if you are doing voiceover work and you do want to go the AKG C414 route, I think the other models may be a better fit for most people. In my case, I think this one fit okay on my voice because it tended to roll off some of that sibilance a little bit. And in fact, my brother uses this for vocals, for singing, and it works pretty decently on his voice. Next up, we're taking a step down in price, the TechZone Audio Products Stellar X2. This is a $200 microphone, and this one is really sort of supposed to sound like a Neumann U87. Again, a very classic studio microphone that's been used on a ton of different recordings, but this, of course, is a much cheaper version of that by a long shot. It's not a bad sounding microphone. I actually quite like the sound of it, especially on my wife's voice. It was a good sound. It was a little bit bright for my particular voice, again, with the sibilance. This tended to emphasize that a little too much, a little bit more than for my taste, at least. Some people, again, like that crisp sound. That's okay. But overall, I think a good sound. For the money, pretty impressive microphone. Now, next up, we have the Stellar X2 Vintage. That's the one that we're recording this session with, in fact. So that's what you're hearing right now. This microphone worked better on my voice, I think, because, again, it has a very different voicing. It tends to be a little bit more mid-forward, and it also rolls off some of the high frequencies. So it's a little bit tamer on the sibilants on my particular voice, and I think it's a better fit for my voice than the Tech Zone Stellar X2. So the vintage version, better for my voice. I think the Stellar X2 probably a little bit better for my wife's voice. So let's head on back and take a look at the Lewitt LCT 440 Pro and talk about that one. So this one is interesting to me. This one actually sounds very similar to the MKH 416 to my ear. And I think it worked really, really well on my wife's voice. It gave this sort of sparkle in the high frequencies that sounded really quite nice. In my voice, it was a little bit on the bright side, not overly so. I think it still worked pretty decently, but I think it especially worked well for more balanced voices without a lot of sibilants. And so if you're looking for something that sounds a lot like the MKH 416 at a much lower price point and in a large diaphragm condenser microphone format, I think this LCT 440 Pure is really worth looking at. Really interesting microphone. So overall, there's a look at a variety of different large diaphragm condenser microphones and my impressions. Now, if you're still interested, I want to say a few other things about large diaphragm condenser microphones and why they're so often used in voiceover. Really, when you're doing voiceover, most voiceover artists or engineers that are doing voiceover type work are really looking for a pleasant sound, a lush sound. A lot of low frequency response for men's voices in particular, but also on women's voices. So it should have this very warm, pleasant, easy to listen to sound. And that's why I think a lot of voiceover artists end up using large diaphragm condenser microphones, or in the case of the MKH 416, something that sounds very much like a large diaphragm condenser microphone. Now, what do I mean by that? Again, there is this very lush sound to it, a lot of rich low end, but they also still do quite a bit in terms of capturing detail and nuance in the higher frequencies as well. They generally are not super accurate sounding. That's one thing I can say, at least from my point of view, about large diaphragm condenser microphones. Even if they have a flat frequency response, to me, they very much sound like a broadcast. They sound rich on the low end, and then they have a crisp high end as well. So they're not generally what I think of as natural sounding or more accurate sounding like a lot of small diaphragm condenser microphones. Now, I did do some interesting reading over at the Neumann website. Neumann makes high-end microphones and has for many, many years. They had an interesting article that talked about the differences between large diaphragm and small diaphragm condenser microphones. And one thing I learned that I didn't know, which actually comes as no surprise as I think back about the specs on a lot of large diaphragm condenser microphones, is that technically, from an engineering standpoint, generally it's easier to make a lower self-noise performance on large diaphragm condenser microphones than on small diaphragm condenser microphones. Just in the overall design, it's easier to do that. I don't know exactly why that is, but that was an interesting thing that I learned. So that's an important thing. And in fact, on all of the microphones that we gave you samples of here tonight and we're talking about, I don't feel like any of them had a problem with self-noise. They weren't generating a lot of hiss, and that's, of course, very important for voiceover as well. You don't want that distracting hiss to take the audience out of the story or out of the program. Now, lest you think that large diaphragm condenser microphones should be used for everything, there are some definite advantages for small diaphragm condenser microphones for other purposes. A lot of times, small diaphragm condenser microphones are better at transient response. They have a smaller diaphragm that can follow the sound waves a little bit more accurately. So if you're, again, looking for a more accurate sound, that's where those small diaphragm condensers generally come in. Small diaphragm condenser microphones are also a little bit better at capturing higher frequencies, and interestingly, they are generally more consistent in terms of their polar pattern at different frequencies, which is really interesting. Whereas a large diaphragm condenser microphone, when you're talking about lower frequencies, the microphone's polar pattern changes a little bit more relative to the high frequencies and relative to small diaphragm condenser microphones. Kind of an interesting thing. I don't know that it makes a huge difference for voiceover, but what I will say in relation to that is that one thing that I don't think a lot of people consider is that which microphone you choose, of course, is an important decision when you're going to be doing voiceover work, but perhaps more importantly is the decision about where you're going to record and what that space sounds like from an acoustic standpoint. And really, you'll notice that a lot of professional voiceover artists will record in vocal booths, booths that are specifically treated and made for the purpose of recording. But if you are in a position where you can't afford that, I can't afford one. We actually did the recordings of the samples in a space in my unfinished basement. where we had sound blankets hanging on 3 sides. And so that kind of does a lot of the same things that you would get in terms of a vocal booth. But the important thing is really you need to manage the reflections of sound off of hard surfaces like walls, monitors. In fact, here we're recording, we do have a monitor here, we have another monitor here, we have a speaker there. We have a lot of hard surfaces, a big desk below us. This is not the ideal place to do voiceover recordings. But what's important is finding a space where you can manage some of those reflections. And if you don't have a studio, if you don't have a place with any sort of bass or broadband traps like this, one place you can consider is recording in your closet. And whether that's a walk-in closet or even if it's not a walk-in closet, if you face the clothing, the clothes will sort of dampen all of the sound before it has a chance to reflect off of hard surfaces. And so you get a better recording or a very clean recording if you're looking for that, which for voiceover you typically are. So overall, what is the takeaway message from this? Well, I think really when you're looking for a microphone, my hope here is that with the samples we gave you and some of my impressions, you'll be able to find something that works well for your particular voice. So if you're not sure what kind of voice you have, whether you have a lot of sibilants, very rich, low, bassy voice, do a recording. Even if you just use your phone, hold your phone relatively close, go into the closet where there's not a lot of sound reflection, make a recording, and listen back to it. Do you have a lot of sibilants, the sizzling from S's and C's? Do you have a very nasally voice? Do you have a voice that has a lot of low end or not a lot of low end and you'd like to emphasize and capture a little bit more low end? All of those things can help you make a decision. And hopefully our impressions here will give you a good sense for which of these microphones might be a better fit, or at least give you some ideas of other microphones that you want to go research more, or maybe you want to research one of these in a little bit more detail. That's my hope. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. If you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that, and we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.